This week, for my last Civil War episode visit to a national park, let's put on our big kid shoes and tromp out to the Andersonville National Historic Site in Andersonville, Georgia. Depressing? Oh my, yes. But I find this incredibly important to bring up, that here we have preserved the evidence of a very bad idea. The hope, of course, is that we do not do this again. The other evidence, though, is that, yes, humans are very good at forgetting things we feel bad about and then doing it again anyway. But hopefully we can stave off the worst of it, so we should consider the place. Begun in the winter of 1863 and finished in 1864 using the labor of enslaved people, including black Union soldiers who were deemed escaped slaves, this more or less blank patch of ground was enclosed in a wooden stockade, that is, an extremely tall fence, to house 10,000 prisoners of war. But at its peak, it held about 33,000. That was so many, there was hardly space for all the men to lie down at night. The planning of this prison was so haphazard and lackadaisical that there was no main water source. A spring appeared in the camp in August of 1864 following a heavy rainstorm, by legend at the location of a lightning strike. The whole thing sounds like a ridiculous story, but to the men faced with the putrid stream flowing through the camp that was used for laundry and a latrine, having a source of non-poisoned water was literally a miracle. The whole thing is pretty terrible. But if you find yourself with time on your hands in southeastern Georgia and want to see a monument to bad decisions, but one that pushes us a little to think on them, the Andersonville National Prisoner of War Museum is a worthwhile place to go. Now, I don't want to go to a place where they just make me feel bad, you say. Well, don't take it that way. This place can be a motivation to make sure the world stops doing things like this. Wars are a bad idea. But more importantly, they are complex. They require coordination and planning, and even then have a long tail of chaos and pain they leave behind. So the Andersonville National Historic Site is here to remind us that war is a mess. Don't start them if you think they're easy. So come in and check out the receipts so you have them in hand, should anyone challenge you with the idea of a simple war. Episode 170. Prisoner of war food for, wait, how many guys? The long tale of war. This week, I'll be wrapping up the American Civil War by taking a hard look at what prisoners on both sides were actually eating, or mostly not eating, and what the physical and political aftermath of all that suffering eventually produced. To find out how prison food in the 1860s connects to international humanitarian law in the modern age, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that this is the last episode on the American Civil War. War is depressing, and this episode is especially depressing, and if you just don't want to deal with that, I understand. Though there is a bit of hope at the end. That said, let's get through the prison food at the end of the war and move on to the time when America starts making more food and things start to get wildly interesting because, boy oh boy, prison food is monotonous, inadequate, and depressing. War food up to this point in American history was limited and monotonous because the main requirements for successful war food were that there be lots of it, that it be non-perishable, and it has to be transportable. And in a world of no refrigerators, no plastic, and only rudimentary dehydration, these limitations squished the main diet down to salted meat, meat on the hoof, grease, and flour, and those lovely desiccated vegetables. Foraging and settlers, the traveling merchants who followed armies, were the main sources of variety. The high point for most soldiers was when a major position was overrun and the stockpiles for the general and his staff were left behind. Suddenly they had access to wine, canned oysters, fruits preserved in sugar, fruitcakes, high-quality smoked hams, all things these men had not seen since before the war, or, for many of them, ever. The food of prisons and the condition of the men in them is possibly better documented in this war than any other war so far. The converging conditions that made this possible was a combination of everyone on both sides having pretty good record keeping, prisons being easier to keep records for compared to soldiers on the march, and the fact that this was the first broadly photographed war. The first photographed war was the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and it produced about 30 daguerreotypes. The next war of note was the Crimean War of 1853 to 56, and this generated roughly 350 images taken by various photographic processes. The Civil War, the biggest war of the 19th century, was preserved in thousands of images, and a startling number of those have survived. These photographs give us records of the war's end, of the prisoners, and their conditions that no previous conflict could provide. Over the course of the war, approximately 670,000 prisoners were taken. Early in the war, on both sides, it was clear that prisons for, wait, how many guys? Was not in the cards for the war effort, at least not at the start, especially back when everyone believed this was going to be a short war. Everyone always believes it's going to be a short war. We'll talk about how everyone was going to go home for that first Christmas in the Great War when we get there. So, in the American Civil War, for the first 2 years, most captured soldiers were paroled in prisoner exchanges. The pressure to engage in large-scale exchanges was popular in the North because large numbers of soldiers were captured by the South in early battles, and the exchanges were also popular in the South because they had little interest in supporting prisoners and draining off food and soldiers as guards. And they could really use their guys back. That meant, by the middle of 1862, prison camps were largely empty, and realistically, neither side had the logistical know-how to effectively administer a prison system that this war was going to demand. If you have millions of men in the field, you're going to end up with, realistically, tens of thousands, or as it turned out, hundreds of thousands of prisoners. And the chances of becoming a prisoner in this war were rather different than what we are used to now. For example, in World War II, your chance of becoming a prisoner was about 1 in 100. So like a 1% chance. In the American Civil War, it hovered between 15 and 20%. In other words, it was estimated that somewhere between 1 in 7 or 1 in 5 soldiers was captured at some point during the war. And at this point, the largest nationwide logistical task the U.S. had taken on setting up was a mail system. So prison for this many guys, especially with the sanitation and nutrition considerations, was completely beyond any challenge people in charge of running systems could imagine. It was an understood rule of war in the age of fancy uniforms and cavalry charges that prisoner combatants should be treated at least somewhat decently. Humane treatment helped ensure that your own captured soldiers would receive similar treatment, and keeping prisoners alive meant that you had living bodies to exchange for your own men. There were rules, of course, that paroled prisoners were not to participate in any activity that supported the war effort, including serving as guards or laborers behind the lines. Of course, this was a polite fiction that both sides frequently ignored. However, as the war ground on and each side experienced more shortages and privations, adherence to gentlemanly rules of war began to erode. What adherence to chivalrous values had existed at the start of the war, when everyone had a clean uniform and plenty of socks, disintegrated, right along with their morale and their shoes. The first significant blow to the system in 1863 was the practice of the Confed side immediately returning to their units. Second was the Confeds' practice of retaining black soldiers, considering them escaped slaves and tossing them into the labor pool, and generally not applying even truncated rules of treatment that were in place for the white enemy combatants. By 1864, all prisoner exchanges had stopped. Now, this put a larger dent in the Confed resources, so the U.S. Army decided that the strategy was worth the suffering of the prisoners in exchange for the hurt it was putting on the other side. The fatality rates on each side are still argued about. Everyone agrees they were higher among U.S. Army soldiers held by the Confederacy, but just how high and how much higher is an area of extended debate. Even now, death rates of prisoners in northern camps were reported to be from 6 to 12%, while claims about Confederate-held prisoner fatality rates range from 15 to 18% on average. Now, of course, there was a large variation from facility to facility, but the most notorious was the 29% fatality rate at the largest single facility in Andersonville, Georgia. Though the largest U.S. Army camps in Illinois, Camp Douglas and Rick Island, had fatality rates around 15%. Overcrowding was the underlying condition of all prisoner of war facilities. Most prison camps had begun life as training camps, but as prisoner volume increased, these locations were repurposed. Forts from the Age of Sail were reinstated and also made into prisons, as barracks in forts are pokey and lack exits, so were relatively simple to convert into prisons. The kicker about the Andersonville prison is that it was short-lived. It only came into being in early 1864 and was built largely using the labor of both enslaved people who still lived in the South and black prisoners captured by the Confederate side. And the horrors of this place abound. One of the most informative, well-written pieces that's easy to access lives on the American Battlefield Trust website under the title Hell Hath a New Name. And I'll put a link in the show notes if you desire, for some reason, to read more. Now, ground I have repeatedly covered. Long-term war camps are hard on the men camping there and catastrophic for the surrounding environment and reliably produce terrible health outcomes. The primary cause of illness can regularly be linked to the fouling of water sources by accumulated human waste. Remember, there's no sewer systems at this point in history. Waste doesn't go away. In regular military camps, there was at least some order and discipline around the placement and maintenance of latrines. In prison camps, managed by people who were holding giant grudges and full of bored, malnourished, diseased, and wounded occupants, you can imagine that the latrine situation was beyond dire, somewhere in the region of catastrophically horrific. If anything, the endured suffering by soldiers on both sides in the prison camps did more to prolong the bitterness about the war than any other single circumstance. So with all that scene setting, let's get to the food in the war prisons. The commissary generals on each side and their downline quartermasters were in interesting positions. The army on each side did not have clear, guaranteed supply organizations set up. Letters and other reports from frontier forts back in the days when the U.S. Army was just like thousands of guys show that the supply even then was pretty chancy. But on the other side, these people did have one of the largest budgets of any governmental department during the war. And even if there wasn't as much food being delivered as desired or at the level of quality that they always hoped for, they were still in control of enormous amounts of food and had access to plenty even when many people were suffering shortages both as soldiers and civilians. As a general rule, you'd think that feeding soldiers would have been a priority, yet more than one person involved with supply would get swept up in fad diets of the day, invoking something like Grahamism and depriving soldiers of adequate meat. They would believe that rough bread, mushes, and other farinaceous foods would fulfill their needs, which sure, a reduced diet works for a guy doing office work all day with his evening constitutional stroll to keep in trim, but a nearly protein, or as they would have seen it in these days, a meat-free diet wasn't going to maintain soldiers who were active for 13 to 16 hours a day. On multiple occasions, commanders on the ground would protest and advocate for feeding their soldiers more because they saw how it positively affected discipline and performance and kept soldiers off sick lists and just, generally created a better army. By the middle of the war, it was generally understood that starving soldiers were ineffective. It meant that the rations the command structure wanted to provide soldiers approached adequate, even if what was delivered often fell short. And yet, there were plenty of people in the command structure who couldn't help themselves but profit off their access to food. Now, shorting soldiers a little to pocket a profit from sales on the sides has been part of every war forever. But it's generally kept in check by the fact you do want your side to win. But the motivations to restrain that profiteering largely evaporate when it comes to prisoners. Men contributing nothing to the war effort with no prospect of exchanges? Well, why not get yours? So you can imagine that if active duty soldiers were finding themselves subsisting on cold salt pork and water from muddy pools from time to time, what was being delivered to prisoners who were contributing nothing to the war effort was terrifyingly horrible. The diet for just about every prisoner was consistently not enough. All of the spoiled food that appeared on the supply lines was routinely rerouted to prison rations. The main way soldiers were supplementing their own short supplies was foraging. But these were men on the move. Men in a prison camp clearly didn't have that option. Though there were stories of the guards and commandants' pets going missing into the bellies of prisoners. There is a comparison to be made between these prison camps and ships too long at sea running out of provisions. They were in danger of suffering similar fates. No food, few ways to get it, and no, or extremely limited, potable water. But a prison camp faced a few extra limitations that made sure their fate was much worse. A ship at sea, no matter how dire the food situation was, well, they never had a sewage problem. And while things could get extremely stuffy and stinky below decks, there was always the promise of fresh air soon. Hatches could be opened and the decks scrubbed down with seawater. In fact, even though it'll make your skin itchy due to the drying effects, a seawater bath is still far better than no bath at all. The limited diets delivered to most prisoners, the meat and grease and a little bread of some sort, terminally left these prisoners deficient in an array of nutrients. Vitamins were not recognized or generally known until well into the start of the 20th century. The earliest papers calling them out as specific chemicals started showing up in the late 1890s and 1900s. But all the same, the diet of these prisoners was perennially deficient in vitamin C, so scurvy was rampant. This meant bleeding gums, heavy bruising, muscular weakness, and a breakdown of vascular and digestive system all meant that they were sickened up front, and so they had a hard time absorbing nutrients when they were provided. Vitamin A was also in short supply, so night blindness, that is poor vision and low light, and then eventually regular blindness were often constant problems. When potatoes, sweet potatoes, turnips, onions, corn, apples, and peaches were available, many of these problems would be mitigated. But again, the soldiers and civilian population would be provided for first, so these foods were consistently in short supply at prison camps. And often underripe produce would cause further intestinal distress, draining prisoners of nutrients through diarrhea and dysentery, and complicating the absorption of nutrients from other food. So some deliveries of produce would actually make things worse for the prisoners. Consistent salt shortages meant prisoners were often sodium and potassium deficient, which causes nerve problems and muscle failure, including irregular heartbeats. The limited diet also meant a lack of milk or any of the hardy green vegetables that could be major sources of calcium. When river fish were provided, men would regularly eat them, bones and all, so fish bones did provide a major source of calcium. Even so, many soldiers suffered demineralization as their bodies cannibalized calcium from their own bones to maintain the ion concentrations required for dependable nervous system function. Now, I guess as good news, the one vitamin the soldiers did not have a shortage of was vitamin D, as it is produced by our own bodies when we get exposure to sunlight. Half an hour of the sun, or even daylight exposure, for every other or every third day allows us to produce an adequate supply for health. The inadequate nutrition, coupled with horrific sanitary arrangements, not to mention extremely poor shelter, meant that a litany of diseases was stalking the prisoners at all times. Frostbite, which led to gangrene, limb loss, and general infection, was a constant problem in the fall and winter. Close confinement meant that smallpox would burn through the prison populations regularly. The dense population of lice and fleas meant that dengue fever and typhus were rampant. And despair was the practical cause of death for many men. A loss of desire to eat or to live at all could cause men to simply waste away, as the effort to survive was simply beyond them. So in the end, the food in prisons that lasted to the end of the Civil War were basically soldier rations, but scanty, rotten, and infested with bugs. It was basically a non-survivable situation. For even those who did walk out or survive to be carried out died startlingly soon after returning home. And it wasn't just the prisoners. Long-term guards and other people who worked at the different prison camps also frequently died less than a decade after they returned home. The experience of being in and around these camps for any length of time sapped something essential out of these men, body and soul. At the same time the Civil War was happening in America, there was also turmoil all over Europe. The 1840s had been years of rolling famine throughout Europe, driven mostly by the potato blight, which sparked unrest and revolution on the continent and mass migration, particularly from Ireland. Jumps in weapons and transportation technology wound up changing the way wars were fought. Artillery that required telescopes and rifles with bullet-shaped bullets over muskets with round lead balls led the way in this area. It was also the last century where the cavalry charge would decide anything. The Western world was taking notice that war was getting bigger and bloodier. And the use of trains also meant war was getting less local. The Crimean War, bringing in combatants and observers from all over the continent, created Europe's first media war. And for America, it was our Civil War with photographs and everything. The Franco-Prussian War in 1870 would be the first major deployment in Europe of many of the technologies and tactics tried out in the American Civil War, and would set much of the stage for the conflicts that would lay the fires that burned in the First World War. But for all of the war tech that came out of the American Civil War, there were also some stark realizations about what this new big-style war meant, with hundreds of thousands and even millions of guys. The prison situation was different, and there had to be planning for it. Now, a peace movement started in what we think of as the Western Hemisphere. Revolutionary thinking, revolts, and coups were also happening, but so were groups of people coming together to talk about the fact that there had to be a better way of solving problems than the death, disease, famine, and rapine and panicked chaos that comes with war. The idea of global trade was starting to work for more people with the arrival of motorized sea travel and the laying of train tracks. Early electronic communication was creating a new world in much the same way the printing press had done a few centuries before. As I'm sure none of you are surprised to learn, the peace movement will make almost no headway. As far as restricting combat methods, they did get everyone to agree that using hot air balloons as bombing platforms should be outlawed. But that was kind of the high point. But as useless as all of this sounds, the movement did establish The Hague, or Den Haag, in the Netherlands, as sort of the neutral ground where future European and later broadly international conflicts could go to be hammered out. And one of the few peace-related initiatives that did grow out of this mess were regulations regarding the treatment of prisoners during war. Now, did and do people follow these rules? It's not perfect, and often it's not great, but at least there were standards to live up to, and there's something we can now point to as being broken. It could be much better, but the conditions produced in a situation of unplanned mass incarceration, well, we all know they can be so very much worse. So I guess at the end of this largely depressing slog through the food of the American Civil War, there is a small glimmer of hope that terrible events can be the impetus for improvements in future terrible situations. Why can't we do this stuff up front? Why must we always delve into the pits of despair to realize we could be doing things better? I don't know. Humans are weird. We have a strange penchant for being terrified of change, even when it makes things less terrible. We're weird, hairless monkeys obsessed by sugar and bright, shiny moving objects, I guess. So that being said, let's move out of this pit of despair that was the American Civil War and try out the next period of American food history, the post-bellum 19th century, which realistically leaks into the start of the 20th century. This is the time when America begins to flirt with packaged food and advertising. It's an exciting time, and there's ice cream for all. Thanks for listening. You can email your questions or quibbles to me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. As always, a few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOA Food, and all this information and any promised links are available in the show description.